Hi, welcome back to the Black Pill. Let's talk about trans issues. Hard to title this video, and that's because of the meanings of the word trans itself. Trans is only recently a word in the English language. Formerly, it was a prefix stuck on sort of borrowed words from Latin, so-called loan words from Latin. Um, like transcendence or transgression. And we sort of backform the meaning of trans from those borrowed Latin words. More difficulty, the meaning of the prefix itself depends on the word it's attached to. And in the field we're talking about, in the field of gender and sex issues, that meaning has changed over time. So, quite difficult to put an appropriate title to this video that everyone would know what it means. And I'm fine, actually. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with people not coming in with too many um, preconceptions, or hopefully not having those preconceptions overly verified. So let's dig in a little bit. Trans, if you consult various dictionaries, you're going to get exactly that it's not a word. If you avoid the transgender meanings, we'll come around to there. Independent of that, it's not its own word; it's a prefix, and it's a Latin prefix. And it depends. The meaning depends on whether it's attached to a noun or a verb. When it's attached to a noun, trans means to span. So the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, the transatlantic cable, right? So here's the Atlantic, and here's Europe, and here's the USA, and there's one cable, and the cable doesn't go from one place to the other place. It lays across the bottom of the ocean and spans the ocean. Signals go from one place to the other along the transatlantic cable. The Trans-American highway system, right? So, as a verb, though, to transcend or to transgress, to transcend means to be in one category with the expectations that belong to that category, and then to transcend those expectations, to show other properties or qualities, or show those qualities in a higher degree than expected. So Simon Pegg is a comedy actor and could easily have been typecast into comedy. But when you look at Simon Pegg's IMDb, he has a lot of roles and performs competently in a lot of different kinds of roles. He's transcended the label of comedian. To transgress means to cross, to cross lines, literal or metaphoric, right? To cross a legal line. Let's put that over here for a second. It's important later. It's important later. Let's come back to it. I started in psychology in the late 90s. Like, I developed an affinity for psychology in the late 80s, and it took a few years um, to make it to college. And I did some other stuff. I fooled around in the military for a while. I whatever. Came back to college late 90s, and that was a that was a very different time. The profession hadn't moved very much past the culture in the late 90s. And the late 90s was a pretty homophobic time to be alive. I mean, arguably, today is a pretty homophobic time to be alive, but the 90s were worse. I remember my psychology professor in college. He was an activist. I never asked him his sexual orientation. It wasn't important to me. It didn't mean anything. He was a bachelor. He worked. He was on the forefront of hospice care for people who experienced HIV, and his patient base was gay men and trans people. So one day In the middle of a term, he brought in a guest speaker, and his guest speaker was a trans woman. None of us would have known um, passing is a thing, and she passed. None of us would have known that she was not born female. God, even those words are getting antiquated. Yep, that's happening. Except that she told us, and therefore we knew. And she told her story. She was frank and open and honest, and really a hero to let a bunch of first year college students sit and interrogate her about her experiences. Um, like, even more than maybe someone doing that now would be, because it was much edgier, much riskier at the time. The general public had much less information about these issues. So my professor, who I respected and still respect, um, he described her as a transsexual. That was the language of the time. He didn't say a transsexual person. He said a transsexual. Um, and he discussed a lot of the work that he did with this population. Specifically, men don't grow up as women, and so when someone transitions from male to female, or indeed female to male, there's a whole other set of expectations that go on that person's behavior and mannerisms, particularly if the goal is passing. Uh, is the goal passing? Well, it depends on the individual. For some people, the goal, in fact, is passing. For some people, the goal isn't. For some people, passing isn't a realistic, a realistic goal. That's very complicated. I recommend you spend a lot of time listening to people in the trans community about those issues. But this psychologist's work was teaching female mannerisms and behaviors to men transitioning to female. So, how do you wear high heels? How do you walk in them? How do you hold a purse? How do you fix your makeup in the morning? How do you fix your hair? How much eye contact is acceptable in America in 1998 from a woman talking to a man? How much body space do we allow? How much do we overtalk each other? All of these gender performances that have to be learned in order to pass as the gender one means to live, the sex one means to live. In this world, in this world, transsexual means being of one sex and intending to cross over into the other sex. Now, if you've been watching the videos in this series, or just you exist in modernity, you can already see the flaw. You can already see the flaw in this thinking. Sex itself is a good foundation for procreation, and all of your ancestors who didn't aren't. Okay, um, but it's flawed. It's not a perfect foundation. It's a construct as much as it's a biological fact. Gender, however, is completely a construct. There is no biological fact of gender. And so the more you think about this, the less sense it makes to have two and only two ways of being. And if you don't fit in one, the less sense it makes to need to move into the other one. By the early 2000s, people had begun to identify not according to their medical labels, the labels psychiatrists gave that population, but with their own homegrown language. And transgender as the descriptor quickly became the norm. sex reassignment surgery or sex change operations, um, those get relabeled. And in modernity, we mostly talk about gender confirmation surgery, which is to make someone's sex, their primary and secondary sex characteristics, match their gender. Don't think about any of this too hard. If you do, it starts to break down because the categories themselves don't really make any sense. The buckets don't properly hold water. The important thing is that as sex and gender evolve in our minds, the labels are going to keep changing. And the important thing is to use the language people wish used about them. Um, Unless they're Nazis, in which case just call them Nazis and move on. Okay. The reasoning behind moving away from sex change to gender confirmation uh, is probably less about the logic of the words than it is about the stigma of the words. Sex changes are a joke from the 70s and 80s, and people would prefer to avoid being that punchline. Um, and that, again, that punchline can be and sometimes is backed up with violence. Even in the 90s, uh, it was an old tired joke that someone could feel like a lesbian trapped in a man's body. And this lovely woman who came to talk to our class had that experience not as a joke, and referenced that joke as a punchline because she knew people in the room were going to apply it anyway. So she used it in a humorous way to talk about herself. So the important thing here is to move away from stigmatizing language that just firmly puts people in categories we can understand and isolate, um, and abuse, and instead listen to people describe their experiences. Okay. So in the past, the process might go like this. One might self-identify a gender dysphoria, which is a feeling that their sex doesn't match their inner sense of self. And it's far enough in the past that gender doesn't really come up in the discussion except to mean sex. They might talk this out with a psychiatrist. And then, after sort of internally cataloging, processing experiences, they might decide that they would want to change sexes, talk this out with a psychiatrist, apply for surgery. Then a psychiatrist would have to approve the surgery. There was gatekeeping here. The person could try out hormones and try out role changes, do some preparatory work, depilation to remove hair from places where the other sex doesn't really have it, or um, hormones to change body shapes, those sorts of things. And all of this was supporting a definite transition from the current sex to the target sex. And there were only two. There were only two possibilities. The present involves a good deal less gatekeeping by psychiatry, at least in America. I understand my home country of England is still pretty transphobic. Still a good amount of good, still a large amount of gatekeeping. In modernity, hormones are more easily available and accessible. Any MD can sign off on hormone treatments. For better or for worse, there's certainly MD intrusion into psychology and psychiatry that is unwelcome. That's bad. That's bad for people. A lot of psych meds get passed out from people without the expertise in those things. The main difference, though, is moving from the verb to the noun. Okay? So a transsexual, that sounds like a noun. But in this context, it's a verb. It's the person transitioning from one to the other. And now we would just use a real noun, just the trans. So before about Y2K, if a person said they were trans, they probably meant transsexual, and in fact, probably just used that word. They mean the medical terminology, and they intended to go from one sex to the other sex. Now, if someone says they're trans, they might not mean that at all. Some people still do, some people don't. They might not acknowledge that there are only two possible sexes, only two possible body configurations. They might see gender as far more important than sex, that one could enact male or female roles without having the male or female body to accompany those roles. They might go part way. They might have top surgery. They might have bottom surgery. They might have only one of those. They might have both. They might have neither. They might take hormones with no intention ever to get any kind of surgery. Even quite recently, some trans celebrities um, get talked about in public spheres in a mocking tone for being women with penises, and your older minds can't really grasp how that would be possible, and it is a it's a punchline. It's a punchline on the Bill Maher show. Individual experiences vary. And man, that's why it's so important to let people describe their selves rather than try to lump everybody into a category that makes us comfortable or worse, powerful. All right. So I'm not really the guy on this. It's not my psychological area of interest. I'm an existentialist. I'm into freedom and authenticity, psychotherapy. That's my love. There for sure, though, is some overlap here, none of which makes me an expert. There are some folks who are out, proud, and vocal with their own stories. If you're not already watching Philosophy Tube and ContraPoints, you should probably be doing that. Those are great channels, just in and of themselves. Their content is really, really solid. And Abigail Thorn and Natalie Wynn both have trans stories to tell, which they tell incidentally along the way. So those are very worth watching and looking up. That's more or less what I have. Um, what's this series in aid of? Well, general information is good. I'm not the guy, but you can't just find all of the trans people and make them explain themselves to you. We have a background responsibility. Folks who are not trans have a background responsibility to have empathy for people who aren't like us and to try to help with the work as much as we can. So there we are. And this mostly is driven by an experience I had in the classroom. A student in class used the words, "So someone wakes up one day and decides they want to be the other sex." And he was about to defend some weird Christian nationalist fascist stuff, some ideology. And we had to have, he said he didn't want to have a conversation about it, but he invited the conversation about it. So I had to do a quick correction. This is a longer correction for people out there like with that thought in their heads. I just want to state two things super categorically. One, that's just not how people with these experiences describe these experiences. They don't wake up one day and decide, life would be better if I were a boy. Um, There's a long and often difficult process to that realization. We talked about some of it, a couple, 3 videos ago. When you live in a heteronormative society and all these gender performances are expected and you're punished for not conforming, you internalize that stuff, and it can be really difficult to have these realizations about yourself. That is, the realizations can be difficult to have, right? It takes a long time even to have them, and it can be painful. And even if this were the standard experience, that someone wakes up one morning and makes a decision, does the government have the right to stop you from living as you want? Even if you're wrong, does the government have the right to stop you from living as you want? That's the important question. When potential governments campaign on anti-trans philosophies, those are not good candidates for government. Those are Nazis. Nobody has the right to tell you how to live. This is America. We have the dignity of risk. We can make mistakes. Okay? So the more we grow up as a people, as a society, the more that we see the lines of gender as arbitrary. And the more we try to learn from others how they want to be treated. The trans thing is a zone of human experience that has never been permitted or even possible the way that it is now. Because we can change hormone levels in adolescence. Because we have laws that protect people whose expressions are atypical. We can live as we want to this unprecedented degree, even controlling our own biology. And the language will follow. The etiquette will follow. That's what I have for you today. That's what I have for the series. This has been the Black Pill. I don't know why you're listening to me.